Hello and welcome to Spencer's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about some of my favourite bookish tropes. And before we get into my list of favourite tropes with examples, I want to clarify what I mean by trope in this context because this is a little misunderstanding that happened to me quite recently. The dictionary definition of a trope is a figure of speech, a rhetorical device, and there is a sort of defined list of such tropes such as irony and oxymoron and alliteration. And I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about what we commonly understand as tropes when we talk about stories. So more precisely, this video should be called my favorite literary cliches, or my favorite storytelling devices, or my favorite common themes in books. But I feel like the word trope has acquired that colloquial meaning, and so we are going to go with that. And if you have any complaints about this, keep them to yourself. Many people say that they don't like literary tropes because the stories are unoriginal or because something has been done before somehow devalues it. I disagree with that. I think that part of what makes a good story is a mix of the comforting known and the exciting unknown. And a good author will take tropes, cliches, themes, whatever you want to call them, and play with them, twist them around and play with our expectations of them. If you have a book that is completely devoid of any common theme, of anything that we recognize as a story, well, then you're reading James Joyce, I suppose. Either way, it would not make for a very compelling read, in my opinion. So I'm a fan of cliches and tropes when they are done well. So I want to list some tropes, cliches, etc. that I really enjoy when they are done well. And for each of those, I'm going to give you 2 examples. Bear in mind, some of those examples that I'm listing incorporate several different tropes, but I'm trying to not repeat myself with this list. The first trope I really enjoy is the survival in the wild, and I think I like that because I myself would be absolutely useless in the wild. I would probably be killed and eaten by the first wild rabbit that came along. I'm the sort of person that would rather sleep in a bed than a tent. I don't find anything about being out in the wild in any way romantic. But in a book, I really enjoy the survival in the wilderness trope. One classic that is famous for using this story is, of course, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. This is a novel from 1719, and when I read it, I was genuinely surprised by how modern and readable it was in terms of language. I have actually done a separate review for Robinson Crusoe, which I'll link in the description box. The draw of this book really is the whole idea of being alone on a remote island and having to figure out what to do, how to survive. And much of the book is taken up by the technicalities of it, the gathering of fresh water and fashioning of weapons in order to hunt animals, and then the collecting of seeds in order to plant stuff. All of that is kind of answered in that book. If you are familiar with Robinson Crusoe, you will also know that Robinson's survival on the island relies very heavily on the exploitation of another man. And that is something I talk about as well in my review. So please, before you pick up the book, do check that out because I think you want to make an informed decision about reading this classic from 1719. A recent publication that kind of scratched that itch for me was Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a book that's based on Greek mythology, although I went into it without knowing anything about Greek mythology at all. In this book, there is a whole section of the story where the main character, the witch and goddess Circe, again lives her life on a remote island. I loved this because, unlike in Robinson Crusoe, there was no real sense of, danger for Circe. She is by herself and she's enjoying her own company, and she is loving having the run of this island and being able to draw from it and being able to purely be herself with no one else around. That's another aspect of the alone in the wilderness trope that I just love. Because I'm an introvert and generally speaking, not very good at communicating with other people. I like this idea of just having nothing around me but nature to draw from, but at the same time not being in danger from that nature, but actually being kind of mistress of it. So if you like stories of solitude and loneliness that are not dark and horrible and scary, I would recommend Circe by Madeline Miller. If you want to hear more about that book, I also have done a separate review video of that, so check that out in the description box. Let's move on to the next trope I want to talk about, and that is what I'm going to call sustainable futurism. Now, I love a dystopian future. In novels, I should specify. I'm not a fan of the direction the world is taking right now, but in literature I do like dystopian fiction. And the best dystopian fiction is that which presents a world that at first sight you want to live in, where you have a feeling of foreboding, where you know that something's not right about this. But on the surface, it seems quite wonderful. And one book that does this incredibly well is the, I believe, 1980s modern children's classic, The Giver, by Lois Lowry. In this book, we are presented with a world that at first glance seems peaceful and happy and sustainable. And these aspects, they are not really described in great detail, they're just kind of taken for granted. Yes, the main characters just ride around on bicycles. There were clearly no personal use cars in the world. The characters don't have to worry about survival in a capitalist nightmare because food gets delivered to the family homes and then the rubbish gets picked up again. So clearly there is some sort of sustainable recycling going on. Every child in the society gets the education they need. Every adult in this society works. There doesn't seem to be a disparity between genders, and everyone's life seems to be valued equally. Happy utopia, what could possibly go wrong? Well, I'm not going to tell you what could possibly go wrong because that would be spoiling the story. But I highly recommend, if you're intrigued by this premise, to pick up the book, The Giver, if you've not read it. And if you last read it when you were 9, pick it up again because it holds up just as well on a reread as an adult. The Giver draws you in with what really seems like a perfectly well-designed, sustainable future. And that makes the horrors within even more horrifying when you find out. And it presents you with a world that seems perfect, but once you dig under the surface, you see that that perfection comes at a very high human cost. My second recommendation for the sustainable futurism trope is a book I read very recently called A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This is really a novella rather than a novel. It's a very short book. And it, unlike The Giver, is not a dystopian story, but in fact a utopian story. At least from what we can tell from this first installment in the series, there really doesn't seem to be anything hugely wrong with the world. It's sustainable, it's peaceful, it really is a utopia. The main character in this world, Dex, has to still fight with their own struggles and, go on a journey, but that journey does not seem to be influenced by a larger social injustice in the world. Do check out my review video for A Psalm for the Wild Built. You know where to find the link, because in that I talk a lot more about those utopian aspects and also the influence of, I think, what's becoming quite a large trend this year, which is the aesthetic idea of solar punk. But now let's move on to my next favorite trope, and that is what I've termed romance across slight socioeconomic difference. There are, of course, a lot of prince and pauper type romances where you have romance across a large societal divide, the princess that falls in love with the commoner, all of that kind of stuff. But what I find more intriguing is when there is a romance happening across a small gap in the socioeconomic circumstances of the participants in the romance. And the first example, I don't need to talk much about that because you'll all know what's coming. The first example is Pride and Prejudice. We have the main character of Elizabeth Bennet, who is, in her own words, a gentleman's daughter, but she is not in the best financial circumstance, sharing her home with 4 unmarried sisters and a parent that desperately wants to get them married off. She lives a life that is, in small but significant ways, different to that of Mr. Darcy, who is not just rich but influential. And those small differences we might not even pick up on to the same degree today as readers did back in the day when Jane Austen wrote the book. But you only have to look at the reaction of Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, to really be aware of how scandalous their relationship really was in the eyes of Mr. Darcy's set of people, of his class. Even though Elizabeth Bennet, moving in the same circle, being a gentleman's daughter, not being a labourer, not being a merchant, not being really, on paper, that much different to him, and yet that small difference sets off a huge chain of outrage. The second example is actually also a classic. For most of these I've tried to find like a classic and a modern book that utilize the same trope, but in this case I just have to talk about Morris by E.M. Forster. And I don't want to spoil it too much for this plot because there are quite a few different relationships and romances in Morris, but the one that for me utilizes that trope of small socioeconomic differences is the relationship between Morris and his university friend Clive. So Clive and Morris, again, at first glance, seem like very similar people. In fact, they have kind of similar families. Like they have sisters and they seem to have a similar relationship with their sisters. And obviously they both go to the same university. And yet Morris is destined to become someone with a profession. He is destined to work at a law firm after university. Clive is a landed gentleman. He is destined to inherit his family's estate and to be a squire, a country squire. So the two of them fall in love at university when those differences maybe didn't matter as much as they would later in life. But the further away the two get from their university days, the more obvious it becomes that they are destined for different paths in life. And that eventually leads to differences, to drama and to heartbreak that really make the emotional impact of this novel. Because of how E.M. Forster wrote the story, similar to Pride and Prejudice, these might be things that you don't necessarily pick up on if you read from a 21st century perspective. You might pick up on the difficulty of having a gay relationship in pre-World War I Britain. That difficulty, that struggle is very obvious in the text, and that is something that's at the forefront of our minds when we read it. But that added layer of having one man who is to be a country squire, who is expected to lead not just his household, but his whole estate, his tenants, and to eventually have a son and heir himself, contrasted with what's essentially an upper middle class, a sort of nouveau riche family where the son is working for his income. That circumstance influences Morris and Clive's relationship more than you might pick up on first reading. My next favorite trope that I want to talk about is something that I have titled cosplaying as rich. And I think you know what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about someone who is an outsider in the upper crust of the world. Someone who has maybe successfully convinced people around them that they belong into this exclusive club at the top. One classic I want to mention here is actually a German classic called Das Kunstseidene Mädchen, in English, The Artificial Silk Girl by Irmgard Coin. This is a 1920s classic, and in it, a young woman from really quite a poor background in a sort of medium-sized German town escapes to Berlin and tries living the high life without a penny in her pocket, without any friends and family there. All she has is a stolen fur coat and a whole lot of character. And so she manages to attach herself to rich men, to really kind of exploit them in a way, because she is determined to live the life of a star, and she does everything to achieve that. It's a really wonderfully funny novel, even if you are nothing like an 18-year-old girl with ambitions, which I certainly am not. There is still so much to identify with her, and you really do root for her success, even if that success is her proudly wearing her stolen coat on the arm of a rich elder gentleman on the streets of Berlin. The second book that utilizes the cosplaying as rich trope, which I think is quite a compelling part of this book and why I think it is so hugely successful, is the 1990s thriller. I think it's The Secret History by Donna Tartt. What genre is this book? I don't know. This follows a young man, I think his name is Richard, but I might be wrong about this, who gets essentially a scholarship to an elite university in America. His background again is very sort of country, it's not like an intellectual background, and he goes to university and falls in with this set of, in one way, outsiders, but in another way, an elite within the elite of this college. And lots of things happen, including the murder of a student. This is not a spoiler, this happens right at the beginning of the book. And throughout all of this, he is fascinated, but also put off by this upper class friend group that he's fallen in with. And he's straddling the line between not letting on that he did not grow up in the same privileged way as they did, but also not becoming like them at the same time. Really fascinating sort of psychology going on in that book. For me, it's that sort of macabre aspect of the upper class that I found so fascinating about this elite university setting of the story. Another trope I really like is diary novels. I'm going to keep this bit quite short because I have made a whole video, I know it's been a while, but I have made a whole video about diary novels, which I'll link below. The first one I want to mention is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This is a Victorian story of a really tragic marriage and of a woman who navigates her way through it and, you know, how she does it. Oh God, I can't talk about this book without spoiling it, so just believe me when I say it's an amazing example of Victorian literature that may as well be written in this century. It reads very modern, and part of that I think is because it's written in large parts in diary form that allows us to get to know the main character directly, firsthand, face to face. We get to hear her voice and we get to experience her story completely unfiltered. The second novel I want to recommend is the 1990s dystopian novel, The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. And this is obviously a completely different genre, completely different time period, but also written as a diary. And again, it's so compelling because the main character is amazingly written. This protagonist starts off as a 15-year-old girl, but even in the early diary entries, you get to know her personality and her charisma, and it is that charisma that carries her throughout the entire story. And you are kind of influenced by her, compelled to read on in the same way as the people around her are. Because again, you get the direct voice, you get the protagonist speaking without filter directly into a diary, and then we are privileged enough to read that diary. Absolutely stunning dystopian literature, one of my favorite ever dystopian novels. The next trope I want to talk about I have termed perfectly loving, unproblematic relationship. Of course, there is a lot to be said for relationships that aren't perfect in literature The main thing is that in books we want conflict, we want drama, and one of the easiest ways to write conflict and drama into a book is to have a romantic relationship be anything other than perfect. So it stands out even more when authors manage to write beautifully loving relationships while still having a book filled with drama and filled with intrigue and filled with plot. One 20th century classic that does this wonderfully well is the post-apocalyptic novel The Kraken Wakes by John Wyndham. I realize that I'm recommending a lot of dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction here. It's just what I like to read, okay? The Kraken Wakes follows a married couple. Both of them are journalists as they watch the destruction of the world by a unknown sea monster, possibly alien, but either way, something's coming from the depths of the sea and it's eating us all. That is the drama, that is the intrigue, that is the plot of the story. Over here, we have the protagonist and his wife just being a loving couple. They're not just devoted to each other, but they also talk to each other on the same intellectual level, which I enjoy. It's not that the man is going off saving the world from the Kraken and the woman is, I don't know, staying at home worrying about him, but they are both out there together. They enjoy each other's company. They solve problems together by dialogue. They have their own different personalities, but those personalities complement each other. And that is just wonderful to see, especially in a novel from the 1950s. Minerva, is this a good idea? Come here. Oh God, no. Where was I? The second novel I want to recommend that uses that idea, that trope, is Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. And that book I have made a separate review video for, you know the deal. This is a historical novel set in the Victorian period, and it plays with some aspects of sort of mysticism and magic and fantasy. And it tells different stories, so it doesn't just follow one main character, but it follows different people, different families and different circumstances. And one of those people it follows is a middle-aged farmer and his wife. Their plot doesn't really have anything directly to do with their relationship, but the relationship is there for us to read, and you can see that it's very loving, and even though they have different personalities, they get on very well and they respect each other. And I think it's a breath of fresh air in a literary world where it almost seems like a must to have a main character unhappy with their spouse. It doesn't have to be like that. There's plenty of other ways of writing conflict into a story, and I think those two novels show that beautifully well. This is a longer video than I'd expected, but let's move on to our next trope that I want to talk about, and that is the spooky English countryside. This one is well beloved by writers of cozy mysteries throughout the decades, but my first example of that is from the turn of the 20th century. I think this was written in 1900 or 1901, and that is The Hound of the Baskervilles by, Arthur Conan Doyle. The Hound of the Baskervilles is set in a spooky manor house in the middle of the countryside, in the dark moors of Dartmoor, and that is different to where most other Sherlock Holmes stories are set. Most other Sherlock Holmes stories, not all of them, are set in London. So you have a bustling, urban, lively setting of the city. But in The Hound of the Baskervilles, we go out into the countryside. This is one of those Sherlock Holmes stories where the setting is a character. The darkness, the gloominess, the fog. The fog is such a major part of what drives the plot. The remote little cottages with shady people living in them, every single one of them suspicious in some way. All of that makes for a really wonderfully creepy read. The second novel I want to recommend that has a spooky English countryside setting is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is the story of a young girl who moves into a big spooky manor house in the middle of nowhere with her new older husband. From the moment she sets foot in Manderley, there is something oppressive about the place. And it is, of course, that her husband's first wife, who died, is everywhere. Her name is on the letterheads and her clothes are in the wardrobe. But it's not just that. It's not just that the creepy housekeeper is clearly way too obsessed with the first wife and doesn't like the second one at all. But the house itself seems to be saturated with the spirit of Rebecca. And that makes the whole setting an intrinsic part of the actual plot of this novel. Imagine Rebecca, but set in a townhouse. It just wouldn't work. The final trope or cliche I want to talk about is the clueless or repressed protagonist. My first example for that is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a novel where we spend the entirety of the book trapped inside the head of the most repressed English butler you can imagine. Close your eyes, picture a repressed English butler, and dial up the repression to 11. And that's how you get the main character of The Remains of the Day. This novel is so British that I can imagine some people reading it and not understanding the humor because it's so subtle. It's the heartbreak, it's the sadness, it's the intrigue and the tragedy and the history. All of the things that make The Remains of the Day such a wonderful book are bubbling just under the surface because the main character is not outwardly expressive in the same way that we might expect from a main character. So the very nature of his reservedness is what makes this book so special to me and why I just love it so, so much. But why I also think that some people just will not get on with it. A novel that is similarly divisive, I think, but that I absolutely love reading is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. And again, we have the main character, the titular Eleanor Oliphant, who is a bit clueless about the world. And that expresses itself in a lack of knowledge of, for example, pop culture, but also deeper down in a disconnect between herself and other people that she tries to navigate with as much determination as you'd expect from any main character. It is a lot less subtly written than The Remains of the Day, but that friction between Eleanor and everyone else is what makes this book such a compelling read. So there you go. These were some tropes, cliches, storytelling devices that I love, that I enjoy. I'd like to hear if you have any more examples, either for the ones I've already mentioned. Tell me about your favorite tropes, as niche and specific as they may be. I want to hear about that. Thank you for watching. Bye.